Hey, everybody. This episode of Supply Shock is powered by Core. You're going to hear a lot more about them later in this episode. But first, a word from our sponsors.
Core is the Bitcoin consumer chain. Stake your Bitcoin, explore Bitcoin DeFi, and earn rewards today. Visit stake.coredao.org/blockworks. You'll hear more about them later in the episode.
Crypto's premier institutional conference is coming to New York City, March 18th to the 20th. That's right, I'm talking about Digital Asset Summit, presented by Blockworks. Of course, I'll be there bringing a Bitcoin maximalist perspective to a number of talks and panels where I'll be discussing why Bitcoin might be headed to $1 million. And, well, the rest of the digital asset market just might be trending to zero. Get your tickets online today, they're selling fast. Everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, here on today's episode of Supply Shock. We're bringing on someone with a long history in Bitcoin, dating all the way back to 2011 when he first read the white paper. So I've known Jeremy Rubin for about a decade, from the time he was airdropping Bitcoin to students while he was at MIT, to his work establishing the university's flagship Bitcoin and crypto programs. Today, Jeremy is one of the most respected Bitcoin core developers, and he works to improve the protocol and to enable new features and use cases. Jeremy's best known today as the author of CTV, a popular Bitcoin soft fork proposal that has drawn support and controversy. He's founder of Judica, a Bitcoin research and development organization. Welcome to the podcast, Jeremy.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's jump in to the endorsement. You are coming out in favor of a certain activation for Bitcoin. For people who aren't familiar, Bitcoin, a software. Periodically, we need to issue new versions of the software for people to run that fix bugs, that make improvements. Some of those softwares are a little different. And this endorsement is you, Jeremy Rubin, coming out and saying Bitcoin should have this upgrade and we should pursue these features. And the upgrades are OP-CTV and CFSV. Is that CF check sig from stack?
Yeah, check from stack.
CSFS. So maybe you can tell everybody a little bit about the roadmap and why you're specifically coming out and endorsing this specific upgrade for Bitcoin.
So I think that the roadmap that Stephen Roos proposed, and I'll explain later a little bit of the backstory of why I'm endorsing a roadmap versus just presenting one of my own, but is to do first check template verify and check sig from stack, and then to do a period of research and development going into like a great script restoration project, which is an effort to really go back and undo some of the hacks that went into Bitcoin script interpreter to make it secure and make Bitcoin script interpreter secure while increasing and really replacing the functionality that was in Satoshi's original version of the script interpreter, just without the security flaws. And then following that with a bumper crop of like new features that will be tailor-made for different applications that will have a little bit better idea of the exact right opcodes to make those really efficient. So it's 3 phases. The first phase is a completely like non-research phase. And so in that phase, it's 2 tools that have been discussed and disseminated, are pretty widely understood, and have benefits for a number of protocols that are both in development and deployed today. The second phase is a little bit more research oriented. There's a couple of questions to do to figure out exactly how to restore that old functionality. And then the third phase is much more research oriented and a bigger topic of conversation. And that leads to a timeline of where CTV and checksig from stack probably can proceed within this calendar year. The Great Script Restoration might be a project taking another year or 2 from today. And then maybe activation within that time frame or activation within another year of that. And then the broader covenant introspection opcodes and functionality that enables protocols is probably a much longer term project where we're really going to look at what applications can we enable and what are the primitives that they might need. And that might be a little bit more encompassing and require a lot more thought into how that's going to impact Bitcoin.
Well, let's wind it back. I think people who are outside the Bitcoin space, have an impression that Bitcoin is not changing, not upgrading. There's certainly a large faction within Bitcoin, pretty mainstream these days, I would argue, that wants Bitcoin not to change, quote unquote, though I'd argue their definition about that is a bit vague. So why do you not support ossification? Why are you interested in changing the Bitcoin protocol to add new features rather than just maintain the project as it is as a pristine digital gold asset that can be adopted by global governments?
A part of it is I started my journey in Bitcoin in 2011, and at the time, I was in high school, so I'm relatively young when I got into it. That's why I didn't just start blasting out Bitcoin pull requests. I didn't really know how to code at that point. Um, but what I did do was go to like Ron Paul rallies. And I was really into the whole libertarian audit the Fed. And when I saw Bitcoin, I thought, oh, this is really like cool. This is instead of, asking the government to do something, this is just like doing it and putting something out there that works in a peer-to-peer decentralized way. So that was really, really fantastic for me. And Bitcoin was never to me just like the technology, but it was this like vision of we're going to build a peer-to-peer electronic cash settlement network that will power a global economy. And when I was in high school, now I'll betray myself as being like like a little bit of a loser, but like I'm kind of boring. But I had a lot of friends who were like really exciting, and those friends were ordering all kinds of things on the internet using Bitcoin. And there was like a real economy happening, a real transactional economy using Bitcoin, and there was no other way to do it. So that I thought was like, oh, maybe this isn't just a, I read about Bitcoin over the summer. I came back to high school, and I saw friends getting stuff delivered, in their mailbox. And I thought that was really, really, like awesome. And even since that moment in 2011, 2012, I don't think I've seen like as much of a real Bitcoin economy develop. I think slowly that original vision of how Bitcoin could be used to power, a libertarian, voluntarist economy, like hasn't really shaped up. And a part of that is because Bitcoin as a transaction platform isn't actually altogether like that great. It has pretty poor scalability, pretty poor privacy. It's actually relatively difficult to secure your coins. And so at a certain point, I started thinking, well, what can we do to improve Bitcoin and how it can do transactions? And I think with the advent of Ethereum and other, blockchains, we've seen that a lot of functionality, one goes into like just like the most like degenerate gambling behavior, but also on occasion there's like really cool new protocols that get developed that have some interesting real world applications. The problem is with all of that development is there's not like a real asset that's strongly desirable. Like nobody really wants to own Ethereum. They'll use it for like gas in their smart contract, but ultimately they end up wanting other assets. And the asset that people really want is Bitcoin because it's this shared purpose and singular focus on we want the most hardcore, decentralized, unfuckable. Well, I guess like maybe you can edit that one out. I know the podcast rules, but can't be messed with protocol that backs an asset. And that's really when I think about why not ossify Bitcoin. It's like, well, we actually want Bitcoin to power the economy. And in order for Bitcoin to power the economy, we need to improve the security. We need to improve the decentralization. We need to improve the scalability and the self-custody. Like those are kind of really critical angles for us to improve. And with the current technologies available in Bitcoin as an application platform, it's very difficult to actually build the types of protocols that you want. And CTV and check stake from stack are two very, very primitive upgrades to Bitcoin. They don't really do a whole lot, but if they're used like a scalpel, you can carefully carve out some really, really nice applications that wouldn't be possible without them, without maybe enabling the whole glut of like DeFi, degen, casino applications at the same time.
Well, I was going to say, I think the Bitcoin arbiter perspective is to look at what's happening on Solana with things like pump.fun and just say, the guy pointing the gun at the goldfish, this is where these kind of systems end up. So when you look at the field of other cryptocurrencies, like what is working in your view? Like, what do you think is interesting that you would like to see come back to Bitcoin, or how do you answer that question when people ask you?
Generally, I think that like money should be competed for. And so I do think that having, this like bumper crop of meme coins right now is ultimately healthy. And the price of those things will, generally probably drop to zero. The market will figure out a pricing for these. There's, speculative things, like a lottery ticket. So we'll probably see those things go away or stay as like a, fad. People buy art, people buy, things that are ultimately a waste of money. So I don't think we're gonna like Bitcoin isn't going to change human nature. And I think that that's sort of like as stewards of the technology and protocol, we're never going to get away from human nature. And I think that one of the ways in which we do get away from human nature is humans like control and they like power over other people. And Bitcoin is a tool, really like a type of government that keeps the monetary system in check. And maybe that gets away from human nature because it prevents one particular type of bad human nature from happening by giving people an alternative that hasn't really existed before. But I don't think that we're going to eliminate these other things. I think it's just like people like to experiment. They like random projects. They participate in things, and that competitive nature is probably just inherent. Good things do come out of that. So one thing that I'll point out that I really quite like is so Uniswap V2. V1 had its little quirks and issues, but V2 I think is still used today. Is actually a really interesting way of launching an asset. And whether or not there should be other assets than Bitcoin, I know there's some people who believe, oh, Bitcoin's the only thing you'd ever want to own. There is such a thing as like a stock or an equity. And an ownership interest in a company is a real thing. Right now, when you go through the process of like IPOing a company, you end up going through a series of like underwriting banks, usually like a couple, and generally you end up paying an immense amount to those banks because the main underwriting bank like buys a certain number of your shares or commits to placing them. Then they find like a purchasing bank who's going to like buy them on day one. And then you end up losing as a launcher of a company, like a pretty substantial amount of money in order to pay these entities to acquire your stock. And then when you look at Uniswap and you look at the ability to do yield farming based on liquidity provision, you actually create a really incentive aligned, decentralized way to launch a new asset. For like a company or for like a DAO is another thing that I quite like. We can talk about DAOs too. So I think that that's something where you see like actual real innovation happening. And whether or not we want AMMs on Bitcoin, I think we certainly want people who are considering to launch a company if they should be using Bitcoin or if they should be using Ethereum to choose Bitcoin. And if you launch a company and you say, I can choose Bitcoin and I can create a token that represents an interest in my business, and I can incentivize market makers to make it so that there's a deep liquidity for people who want to buy and sell an interest in my business, that is something that can create a real economy on Bitcoin. I think that that's a positive development. You also see a knock-on benefit of, for scalability or for privacy is that as more and more, users come in, you might say, oh, well, we want privacy over our trading activity, or we need to support more trades, and solutions for more scale also get developed. So I think one thing I would say just in defense of these other ecosystems is you see a lot of innovation on scale and privacy that you don't necessarily see on Bitcoin because there's more economic activity which is willing to pay for those things.
HODLing isn't enough anymore. Bitcoin is evolving on Core, unlocking yield, utility, and a thriving DeFi ecosystem. With over 250 dApps and nearly $1 billion in total value locked, Bitcoin DeFi is growing fast. Hundreds of thousands of users are already staking, lending, and building on Core's high-speed, low-fee rails. Now it's your turn. Whether you're a user or a builder, the Core Ignition program rewards you for participating in Bitcoin's next evolution. Unlock your Bitcoin and use Core. Start earning with Ignition today at ignition.coredao.org/blockworks. For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com. Unlock the power of your Bitcoin with Ledn. For over 6 years, Ledn has helped thousands HODL their Bitcoin while accessing liquidity, focusing on transparency, security, and trust. Learn what your Bitcoin can do for you and see why so many clients trust Ledn. Visit ledn.io to learn more.
One of the things I think a lot about, I know you were at some of those early conferences with myself as well, 2013, 2015, there wasn't the cultural split of Bitcoin and crypto. There hadn't really yet been the fissuring of these communities into two separate ethoses, visions, attempts. When you look back on that, where do you think the divergence came? How do you explain that?
Yeah.
And then what do you think of the ecosystem today? Like, how do you describe where we ended up from that genesis point?
I think that this is more of a vibe than a history, and you're the Bitcoin historian, so you can break it down and tell me where I'm wrong. But originally, Blockstream and Ethereum were like the same project, and not literally, but the mind share between those groups was actually like pretty heavy. And there's even some common people, like I think Andrew Miller is an example of, he's both, if you read Vitalik's history of Ethereum, he's cited as being very influential in the design of Ethereum. And he's also one of the co-authors of Blockstream's like sidechains paper. So and there's some other, corroborating things to this narrative of like, okay, all these people were talking and hanging out. And there's a pretty big divide of how Vitalik ultimately decided to go about bringing Ethereum into existence. And I think one of the historical accidents that we had was to define the Bitcoin culture as being the opposite of what is being done by Ethereum. Anytime you define yourself as the opposite of another group who doesn't define themselves as the opposite of what you're doing, then you can't really necessarily take anything that they're doing well and incorporate it into your own. And that was something that was claimed for a long time. So, we'll learn from the other blockchain ecosystems and take the winning ideas and we'll bring them to Bitcoin. But we've really not seen any example of a winning idea from outside being actually brought to Bitcoin. We've only seen ideas that Bitcoiners have had that aren't really possible to do well on Bitcoin being rolled out successfully in other ecosystems. So I think that that's an example of where early on there was this research community that was trying to figure out a way to improve Bitcoin. And Ethereum said, we're going to, tokenize and create this whole new, chain for world computer type thing. And then you had the more blockchain direction of, we're going to go with side chains and we're going to add functionality there. And we're not going to add stateful smart contracts. It's going to look like Bitcoin. And that side is kind of ultimately proven to be irrelevant. And Bitcoin is not, as a community, been able to take a deep look at what is Ethereum doing and how can we, or what applications have developed and how can we actually bring those to Bitcoin?
Well, there is this sense that Bitcoin is more conservative, right? And so if you look at the Bitcoin development history, certainly there was, the fissure between should there be hard forks or soft forks and things like that. When did you start interfacing with the Bitcoin core community? What was your first experience with that group? And then, what were the kind of formative events that kind of shaped your thinking on just, development and upgrade process? Because this is where I think you get into the more interesting, sort of philosophical debates about what choices developers can make and how that impacts the properties of the protocol. So I'm curious, how you think through that.
Yeah, so I really started getting involved in those discussions and with the core community in 2014, 2015. So I think that was relatively early on in terms of Bitcoin's navigating more contentious upgrades. I was one of the founders of Scaling Bitcoin conference series. And I was the first program chair. So I had to navigate the complexities of how do we build out a program for an event to get everyone to the table. I think that ultimately Bitcoin is an aspiration. and we project onto it, these hopes that Bitcoin will be the strongest asset, hopes that we'll be able to use Bitcoin in this way or, use it in another way. And when Bitcoin doesn't deliver on that, it's actually, it is actually changing from how we expect it to be. So I think that that's maybe a little bit of a, hard one to get your head around, but changing Bitcoin can actually keep it the same is kind of the point that I would make. So an example of this is early on, Bitcoin had pretty good privacy because no one was looking. But as soon as people started looking, well, now the privacy is kind of worse. And then it turns out that any activity we were doing before, maybe can be linked or figured out. But if you bought Bitcoin from like local Bitcoins and nobody was keeping a record, there's no record. Now, if you buy it, okay, well, they bought it from Coinbase and then you have the record. But early on, somebody was mining the Bitcoin. And then if you bought it from them, you either mined it yourself or there was no bookkeeping, no record. There's no way of actually tracking that information out. So the privacy for an individual user is actually pretty good. If you wanted Bitcoin to buy something, you really could just run your computer for a couple of days and have enough Bitcoin to like maybe make a purchase of something. Then it became worse and worse and worse and worse. And so if you say, oh, well, maybe, making a change to Bitcoin to improve privacy is a change, you go, well, privacy actually used to be better. So that has been changing in how people relate to Bitcoin.
Well, some of those things, right? Like, I mean, it's impossible today for somebody to plug in a laptop and make enough money for a purchase, but that's just impossible, right? That's just a function of the system as it should be designed, right?
Sure. I mean, I think that another point of it, though, is like it used to be possible to send transactions with no transaction fee. And there was like a priority transaction, and old transactions that had been sitting around would just get mined as like some sort of, just to make the system work nicely. And then that stopped being, it wasn't really economically rational. And I think that that's one of the big changes that has sort of happened in the community is the Bitcoin white paper says that Bitcoin requires a majority of honest nodes. And that's been something that everyone from the sort of scientific side has been pretty unhappy with that requirement and has really wanted to change that to Bitcoin has big economic costs and everyone is rational. And if people are rational on some sort of value framework, then they're going to do the good behavior. So they wanted to shift Bitcoin from a Bitcoin has an honest majority to Bitcoin has a rational group of people who make the honest behavior happen. But that's a change. And I think there's oftentimes we'll see things that are game theoretically rational.
What's an example of that? I'm having trouble with. I understand that you're saying the white paper said honest participants. You're saying the development community now wants people to be economically rational. Like, I think is that the right way to phrase it? Like, what is the difference between those two things?
So I think an example is like within like mempool policy is Bitcoin Core as an organization has worked very hard to have like a really good transaction selection policy. And there are miners who, have their own separate, transaction submission service. It's rational for them to, if someone's willing to pay more, to accept a transaction of any sort. And so that's an example of where miners happen to actually be rational, but then Bitcoin developers generally want them to be honest and not accept 4 megabyte inscriptions because they're not policy. So there's sort of a discrepancy of where, maybe it's not good for the network if these big transactions can get broadcast. And so there's not you can't relay these things around. And there's an expectation of being honest. And then that creates a sort of mismatch between the rational behavior of miners to maximize their fee revenue and the honest behavior of, promoting I don't really think that it's spam, but those of the camp would call it spam transactions. So that's an example of where there's a discrepancy. And then there are also discrepancies when it comes to some of these theoretical like mining attacks of like, oh, a miner could attack the network by mining blocks that look like this and this and this. And it turns out miners don't really want to get that because I think it makes the network lower quality.
I mean, maybe a succinct other explanation, or this is, I think, one way you could categorize the Bitcoin history is early on, it was a developer-led project. There was sort of a lead developer, whether that was Satoshi Nakamoto or Gavin Andreessen. There was an active development process in which there were a lot of changes happening from, 2010 to 2015. There's this great flurry of just improvements, tweaks. You get things like check lock time verify and things like P2SH. There was a lot of changes and optimizations, mostly kind of filtering out some of Satoshi's, more errant, coding, right? So from 2015, there tends to be, I think, there's a slowdown, right? There's kind of the game theoretic components of the industry sort of fighting over the SegWit process and that becoming very protracted. And then I would say maybe with Taproot in 2021, it happened, but the process of how it happened seems very irreplicable. There was a small group of participants who, developed a technical consensus around it. There was a pretty bespoke, to use a charitable term, like activation process around it. How much of this do you just think that people by and large within the Bitcoin community have just been turned off by the activation process and that there isn't an easy answer for how to activate things? Because even right now, let's just say, CTV and CSFS, people want to activate that. There isn't really even a blueprint at this point, for how to do that, unless you replicate some of the idiosyncrasies of Taproot. So I don't know. How do you think through that?
Yeah, I think that there's one perspective that sometimes I kind of hold maybe a little bit jokingly, but I can tell you that the only thing about like the next activation is that it won't look like the last one. And that is something that may always be true, is if you think about Bitcoin as like, okay, we want this decentralized system, we want it to be really hard to make changes from a bad actor, why would you ever do the same thing that you did before? The process should always look different, so no one can be satisfying some previous check.
Right. It's like the process is itself a security hole, like, and that can be
Yeah.
co-opted.
And I think that that is a perspective that a lot of people have. I think that the ultimate dangers are actually more when there is an uncertainty, because uncertainty is something that like bad actors can take advantage of. And if you made a process that's maybe relatively good, it would be much harder for a bad actor to take advantage. And I think an example of where that could happen is if there were a security issue that required fixing and the consensus process was not sufficiently developed to be able to deploy a security fix quickly, then someone who's maybe like fascistic can come in and be like, well, I'm going to be the leader. I'm going to deploy the new client because we need to fix this issue. And you can either be on team, pants down, or you can be on team, we're going to fix it. And people will maybe probably flock to that team to get the issue fixed. And then that is sort of like an emergency powers. And usually, once exercised, emergency powers are rare to be relinquished. So I think that that's where, I worry a little bit more. And I think a more streamlined process would actually give more security overall. Even if you can, say, oh, somebody might learn how to game it. It's like, okay, you can still see how they're participating publicly, trying to game it, versus right now it would be completely behind the scenes. Someone shows up with $1 billion that they're ready to spend on just sort of Sybil attacking the undefined process, as is to get their preferred change in.
The only thing better than stacking sats is staking them. With Core's self-custodial Bitcoin staking, you can earn yield on your BTC without ever giving up custody, no new trust assumptions, no counterparties, and no slashing risk. Still your keys, still your coins, now your yield. Here's how it works. Lock your Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network. Help elect a Core validator and start earning Core rewards, passively, securely, and without risk to your principal. And with dual staking, you can boost rewards by staking Core tokens alongside your Bitcoin. Institutions can also tap into Bitcoin at scale with top custodians. Don't let your Bitcoin sit idle, put it to work. Visit stake.core.dao/blockworks to start staking today. For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, LedgerStacks, and LedgerFlex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com. If you've been around Bitcoin for long enough, you've heard the term HODL and the name Ledn. Ledn has been the go-to specialist in Bitcoin lending for over 6 years. Ledn helps you unlock the liquidity of your BTC, allowing you to HODL while still accessing the wealth of your Bitcoin. Ledn has been battle-tested with a focus on transparency, security, and trust. This has allowed them to build a proven track record of client success and security, helping tens of thousands of clients harness the value of their digital assets with confidence and peace of mind. Learn for yourself why so many clients trust Ledn by checking out Ledn's Trustpilot or their reviews on social media. And to learn more about what your Bitcoin can do for you, check out ledn.io.
Well, there's an interesting paper that was put out by Steve Lee, I believe, and I think it was Lynn Alden, just kind of defining the development process, trying to kind of, in your way describe it. I think me and you have witnessed it. I don't know if it's describable, but one of the more interesting takeaways that I had from that is this idea that there are, in fact, different types of consensus, that there is, such a thing as technical consensus. There's such a thing as a sort of like Bitcoin business community consensus, and such a thing as like a larger social consensus, right? Where are you in terms of, do you think that that's a real kind of, distinction there that is like matters and is meaningful? Because I think when a lot of people, maybe we'll get into the reaction around OpCTV and maybe some reflections on that in a bit, but, some of the objections to your original proposal of OpCTV, were around this idea that, the right order of consensuses wasn't followed, or that there's some consensuses that are maybe, more important than others, that the technical consensus is sort of sacrosanct, and that's the thing that should really happen kind of first before something goes to the larger community of users. Your thoughts on that distinction, and if it's valuable?
So I've not read the full report. I think I watched like Steve or Lynn's talk about it. It's difficult to produce a report like that fully captures the reality. AJ Towns also recently put out his version of that, and they differ. And so if you have one of the if you have like a product manager saying this is what it seems like, and then you have a leading developer saying, well, I think it looks different, then they're not agreeing on what the actual process is. So I think it's not, it's far from consensus as to what consensus even is. And that's without injecting my own opinion of,
Right.
If, Stephen Lynn had captured that concisely, then AJ
Well, I just
would
think
have
they're
had.
just talking about like, there's just a distinct
No,
idea. I just use that paper as an example of like that there are different types of consensus, right? So this
yeah.
is, we think of Bitcoin as a consensus system and other cryptocurrencies as consensus systems, but then you sort of get into the reality of, okay, well, what does that actually mean? And I think there's really two sort of views. One of them I would say is that, developers come to consensus. There's a technical consensus that must form, and then the users sort of acknowledge that consensus. The other one is that simply the users acknowledge consensus and always dictate consensus. There's some different theories in there in terms of like how or why these things happen. I'm just curious which ones do you really think like technical consensus is individually important? And what is your thoughts on like the technical consensus process?
And I know that you are asking a concrete question, but it is helpful to talk about the specific example of like during CTV, previously. So during the 2022 activation effort, that was something that people said is, you don't have technical consensus. Show me the technical consensus. And I asked, well, what is technical consensus? And at that time, nobody could really even define what it was. It was I'll know it, when I see it. And then I said, okay, so what's your evaluation framework for that? And it would be like, there's no evaluation framework. So then technical consensus ends up being, okay, so you are deciding if it's been reached. So technical consensus is just some influential individual goes on Twitter and says, I want this. And then that's technical consensus. And I think that this is where I maybe made a mistake, is I went and I read everything that everyone had written. And I said, okay, based on everything everyone's written about what they're looking for, this has technical consensus. And that, sort of calling that, hey, I've read what everyone's line is, and this is past what everyone stated their line is. People want to call that for themselves. They don't want to have that called for them. So as soon as you say, okay, you gave me a list of constraints and now they're satisfied, people still want to be able to say, well, I want to now ask for something else. I think one thing I've also noticed is, and I push this point of view, often, is when you're seeking technical consensus, please do your own original thinking. And a lot of developers will say, well, I want to know what this other person thinks. And you end up with deadlocks where one developer who should be able to do some amount of original thinking says, I want somebody else's take on this. And then I'll just go along with what their take is. And I think that's actually relatively low quality technical consensus. Higher quality is if you get people who actually, actively form their own opinion or thought. And I think we see that today with like there's this covenants page, and you can go and you can read everyone's rationale on why they're supporting one thing or another. And a lot of the rationales are like crap. So some people have been like, oh, we're going to make points and see who said yes, who said no. And I don't think that really matters. But what does matter a little bit more is you can go and you can read what everybody individually wrote. You can say, okay, well, what's their previous body of work? Like, who are they to have this opinion in general? Like, are they engaged with the subject in a way that you think that they're a competent reviewer? And then what's the aggregate opinion of that? You also can't force everyone to say anything. So a lot of people aren't represented there. If you're just negative on the whole idea, maybe, you're not going to engage at all. But I think that that's where for technical consensus, I don't even think Taproot had technical consensus. So it went forward, in my opinion, for other reasons. And I'll say that because maybe I'll, I dox myself a little bit, but I was pretty vocally opposed to Taproot's design. And I think that a number of those design points have since resurfaced as like, oh yeah, maybe we didn't want this. And that's come up in like the great script restoration of we can change some of Taproot's designs. But I don't really think Taproot had technical consensus. I don't think it was sufficiently reviewed in terms of like some of the cryptographic things. But it became popular. And it became popular, sort of because of people's endorsements. So the notion of technical consensus gating, I don't even know if Taproot, for example, truly had technical consensus or was just popular among a different crowd. And you can even roll that back to looking at like Segwit is, certain other proposals also had some level of like technical consensus, but Segwit is what rolled forward due to like, sort of a more general notion of popularity. And I think you'll remember at the time, there were other things that, seemed to have some level of technical consensus. But because of a political process above that, those things got scuttled because people got.
Well, I think like there was one thing about the Segwit process that is very distinctive from today, and maybe this helps to bring it in, is that there was a lot of immediacy to the Bitcoin upgrade process and the Segwit process that I think if you were to strip that out, you would have a very different discussion. But I think the reality of Bitcoin at that time was we were early in the Bitcoin cycles, right? Really only had seen one bull market where Bitcoin had gone up to $1,000. There wasn't this clear idea that Bitcoin was going to survive and thrive and continue to gain kind of like economic, valuation without our direct effort, right? So I think like back in that time period, there was more of this association between like we, the developers, and I think like I most strongly think about this with Gavin Andreessen because, in Gavin Andreessen's, when he started in 2010, and he took over the project from Satoshi, the difference between him making it a little bit easier for somebody to put a Bitcoin address on a website that had a material impact on the economy. So I almost think of Gavin Andreessen as this developer who's frozen in time, where it's he really did like or the people who were back then working on Bitcoin, maybe that gives him a little bit too much credit, but there was a much stronger like direct link between their like personal actions and then the results on the economy. We didn't really know that this was the case, and there was a lot of faith in the development process as being the thing that was actually providing a lot of value to Bitcoin. I guess that's my summation point there. But that has gone away, right? And so how do you explain that part? Because it seems like if you were to review Segwit, even just the idea that we would want bigger blocks, and it's still a controversial thing. There certainly, as you can see from the fee market right now, those larger blocks aren't being used, which kind of makes the whole drama a little bit funny in retrospect. But yeah, like what why did the immediacy fade in your view, and can that immediacy come back? Because I think, or do we even need that, right? Because there's also this idea that Bitcoin upgrade should be a non-controversial, right? Which is another sort of classic callback from that time period where, the claim was that Segwit was uncontroversial. That's why it was being merged. So I don't know. I'll stop there and I'll let you pick it up.
Most of the developers are maybe like good developers, but like very bad politicians. And part of what we're seeing is developers just like trying to be politicians. So one of the main critiques for CTV is it doesn't do enough, but it was designed to be upgradable. And it wasn't really designed to be, this is the end all be all you'll ever need for governance. It was, hey, this is like a step that the community seems ready to make. And
Right, you would sort of pitch it as the safest kind of option for
yeah,
them.
and a number of like good applications. And then, TechSig from Stack similarly, with CTV enables a couple other things that people really want. And it's really not controversial. From the development community, there really was not anyone who was like, this is like just going to ruin, Bitcoin, be unsafe, or is poorly designed. CTV actually went through 3 like major revision cycles, or maybe 2 revision cycles, because it came with a 3rd version, where a lot of community feedback went in to improve it and make it, sound. So it wasn't super controversial. But then what started happening was people started going like, well, this might be the last upgrade we ever get. This might be the last time we ever upgrade Bitcoin. And I think what people made the maybe, sort of conceptual mistake on was thinking that the last time we get to upgrade Bitcoin was like a bullet in the chamber that you can fire and then you're out of bullets, instead of like a closing window. And I think it's much closer to a closing window of like, at a certain point, it will get a lot harder. Bitcoin will be much more distributed. There will be, it'll be much harder to coordinate people to take any action. And if you don't do any upgrade today, then you also may not get any upgrade later. And I think there are so many factors that go into that. Is if we waited, let's say, a decade, are any of the developers who've ever done soft work still going to even be working on Bitcoin? So it's just like a competency that we'll probably like lose over time, and then have to like refigure out how to do that both socially, but also technically. And I think that in terms of like the immediacy of a change of, I guess you're saying immediacy to mean like that it has a big impact on the economy,
Well,
or
I think the perception of Segwit was that it had to be done, right? Like, and there was so one of my things that this gets into my like historical thinking on the quirks of this, but I think that like, what's odd is that I think the third perspective has kind of worn out. But if you look back at the 2017 era, there was really 2 sides, right? The big blockers and the small blockers. That's the colloquial narrative, right? Is that there was some group that wanted to, aggressively raise the size of blocks and then pursue certain tactics like hard forks in order to do that were seen as risky. There was a group, the small blockers, that wanted to keep blocks small and, pursue a less aggressive change with a soft fork, an opt-in upgrade in order to enable that. But then the irony is that I always say is that the block size wars is that both groups wanted to raise the block size and that the block size was effectively raised. And so what's odd is that I think you have from those 2 groups where, one of the I think historical idiosyncrasies is there's this idea that one of those sides won, right? I actually don't think that that's true. I think there was kind of a third group that sort of was saw the entirety of the development process as something that was very suspect. Saw it as that something that could be and was being co-opted, and that was being used kind of against the users, and that it is that actual like viewpoint that has gotten more merit. Because if you look back, I think on obviously the argument for Segwit being, malleability fixed was very strong, and obviously there was merit to that. But then there's the whole sense that Segwit in and of itself was a political compromise. The end result of that development process was that there was a meeting point between what the 2 sides wanted. I know that both sides don't actually acknowledge that, so I know that that's not true, right? Like I know that they don't think that's true, right? The big blockers aren't satisfied with the political compromise. And the small blockers weren't, I don't think, satisfied with the political compromise, or maybe now aren't satisfied with the political compromise. but there was a political compromise from that process, right? So there was a decision that was made by the community, and I think there's a dissatisfaction now looking back, and thus there was a dissatisfaction with the development process among the people who are even know enough to know about it. And so then the question is, how do you move forward from something like that, and then how do you gain, momentum back towards, this idea that we are upgrading Bitcoin, right? So maybe talking about CTV a bit, right? So you proposed CTV very quickly after Taproot, right? Taproot was activated. I think there was.
Actually, I proposed it before, several years
What you
before.
say?
Several years
Oh,
before,
okay.
actually. Yeah. So it was originally
Okay. Well,
proposed.
maybe I think I most strongly remember you at like the kind of peak of the original kind of conversation, like in the
Yeah.
early 2022.
Well, I mean, I'll give you some of the history of it is, I'll stick to my claim of developers are like pretty good devs, but like bad politicians is I initially proposed CTV in like 2019. The BIP was finalized in 2020. And then I was told by very many, people to stop trying to activate CTV before Taproot, or kind of like we'll ruin your career. We'll run you out of town. We're going to blame you if Taproot doesn't go through because you're going to distract people from Taproot. And after Taproot goes through, then maybe we can talk about covenants, but don't talk about covenants now, or you're going to destroy Taproot. So that I was ready. I was actually had started advocating, and then I said, okay, I'll be patient and wait for Taproot.
Well, I guess like what I wanted to get into was OpsCTV was proposed. There was initial kind of discussion about it, which was amongst software proposals was pretty widespread, right? There was a lot of discussion, if not a lot of satisfaction. 2 years later, 3 years later, conversation still going on. There's increasing, I think, even most of the original critics of OpsCTV have come around. I think they're critical of you, or they're critical of some part of the process, but their criticism of the actual technical upgrade seems to have diminished. So maybe why do you think that we're there? Why do you think we are at a place maybe where consensus could form around OpsCTV now if it didn't back then?
Well, I'll say for one thing, part of why the discussion around covenants is actually more difficult than around these other upgrades is it's actually a bigger departure in terms of Bitcoin's capabilities than any upgrade that's ever happened before. So Taproot and Segwit and P2SH, generally, they're all making things that you already do in Bitcoin work a little bit better, and not really adding a fundamental new capability for the most part. Maybe you can make some arguments that certain things are fundamental new capabilities, but even for Taproot, the idea of like an aggregated key in Ethereum with ECDSA, there's like very many well-developed MPC ECDSA key management solutions. So all of these things are just kind of optimizations and efficiency gains, and the fundamental new capability type of upgrade hasn't really happened. CTV itself straddles this border between optimization and fundamental new capability. And checksig from stack is fundamental new capability. And so for CTV itself in particular, you can say it's just an optimization of pre-signed transactions, because you no longer have to do an interactive protocol to get the pre-signed transaction. So you can think it one way as just an optimization, and then you can look in another way and you can say, well, actually getting rid of pre-signed transactions really opens up a number of use cases that would not really be possible in any way, shape, or form without this. And I can give some examples of that. One example that's popular right now is Arc. Arc is a new type of payment scalability platform. And Arc is possible today using pre-signed transactions, but it's kind of inefficient. And one thing that definitely isn't possible today is to use Arc for mining pool payouts for a non-custodial mining pool that never takes custody of the funds. Now, maybe there's some way that you can make it work, But generally, that interactivity is like the threshold issue that makes it not viable or viable. And so it's a fundamental new capability that having check template verify enables. And I think that that's sort of the main point when you go beyond CTV. And this includes check from stack, even though it's still just a small step in the in the more functionality direction. But definitely when you look at the combination of CTV and check from stack, or you look at opcat, or you look at optx hash, is you then get into the territory of, oh, we actually really have to completely rethink of how users are going to use Bitcoin. Before any upgrades, people were doing counterparty. So like runes and inscriptions, it kind of existed. Channels existed. All the stuff that people are doing all existed, but post covenants, there'll be things that weren't really possible to happen on Bitcoin happening. And that's sort of where this upgrade is unlike any other. And that's why the discussion has been unlike any other, is because we're really talking about changing the nature of the transactions that are happening on Bitcoin. And I think that's just is a really big departure for people.
And so this is just, you're talking about this, the aspect of covenants, which, you're putting spending restrictions on a UTXO. It's just, this is categorically different from any other upgrade that we've seen.
Generally speaking, Bitcoin programming tools, like, new script types, new opcodes, are programming at the script level. And check template verify and other covenant opcodes allow you to do programming at the transaction level. So you, instead of programming the individual UTXOs, you're able to make programmable transactions. And programmable transactions is something that just has not existed before. So that's why it's kind of a fundamental new capability.
So you're saying the difference here is basically that just by freezing or being able to prohibit a UTXO from future spending conditions, that this is different than any other upgrade before. This makes the conversation should be longer, and it needs to be more mature because of this specific functionality that we're adding.
Yeah, and I think that prohibit is kind of the wrong word for some of this. It's really like pre-plan which transactions you want to do. It's not like stop some. It's in security, this is like whitelist versus blacklist. Is you're not saying, oh, like don't send to this person, don't send to this person. You're saying transactions from this UTXO should match this specific pattern or this type of pattern. And CTV is really just like the most basic pattern, which is like this exact transaction as well as we can specify it. And other upgrades like TX hash or cat, you are able to do more malleable shapes, whereas CTV is like has to be this specific shape, or one of these 30 shapes is kind of the limit with CTV. And CTV by itself, with check from stack, this changes a little bit, is fully enumerated. Is you can say this shape can then have outputs, and those outputs can go to this shape, but eventually that ends because you say, okay, and then the final shape is this, and you get UTXOs, and those are plain UTXOs with no restriction. When you go a smidge beyond CTV, you can then say, well, in perpetuity, this coin has to do transactions that match this pattern. And so then that's a slightly different universe for Bitcoin to be in than it was before. So even though like lines of code, like things like Taproot are much larger changes, things like CTV and opcat are much larger conceptual changes to how we think about Bitcoin and what types of technology and protocols will be built on top of it.
And this is something that I've missed not following closely enough as I should. Op CTV and Op CSFS. I'm going to get that right eventually.
Yeah.
What's the union of these? Why are these two proposals being mentioned together? Like, what is the specific thing that they do together well, or are they just different ideas? Maybe you can talk through that.
Yeah. So check from stack is basically all it does is let you verify that a given message or piece of data was signed by a particular key. Bitcoin already has this capability. It's just the message that you can sign is the transaction that you're inside of. So if a script does a regular check sig, that regular check sig just checks the transaction itself. And then check sig from stack lets you check an arbitrary piece of data that could come from anywhere. This has a myriad of applications by itself. An example is that you could do like an Oracle type server, and you could say, let this Oracle sign off on a value that I'm going to use in my program somewhere. You can do key delegation. So you could say, I have a transaction or I have a coin that's in my cold wallet, and then my cold wallet is just going to authorize another key on my hot wallet to be able to do a transaction. So that's an example of where you could use something like check sig from stack just by itself. It turns out that when you have both check sig from stack and CTV, you can use check sig from stack to sign the argument that goes into CTV. And if you do that, that enables you to basically create what's called Ledn symmetry, which is also been called Decker channels, has also been called ELTOOL2. And what that is a way of re-engineering the Lightning Network to be able to better support multi-party channels, as well as to reduce the requirements on operators of the Lightning Network to store all of their historical data. And it also enables you to outsource some of the recovery services to third-party servers, which currently don't fully work. So it has a number of benefits for Lightning. And previously, there was an upgrade called SigHash any prev out, which was proposed. And you can use SigHash any prev out basically to create checksig you can use SigHash any prev out to create check template verify or something very similar, but you can't use it to create checksig from stack. And that has a couple implications for how the protocols that you build using SigHash any prev out have to be architected. It's a little bit more general and flexible if you have the two components, checksig from stack and CTV. And then not universally, but for example, Christian Decker, who is the author, of these Decker channels, he's recently endorsed this roadmap forward with CTV plus checksig from stack. So for him, that's a satisfactory path forward. Or you can look at his specific tweet at what he said. I don't want to interpret it wrongly, but that was at least how I read what he'd written.
So maybe we could talk about okay, so that's a little bit about what the actual semantics of what's happening is. What gets unlocked other than maybe the specific things about Ledn symmetry and ARC and some of these other kind of protocols being able to function a little bit better. Do you have an idea of what's your vision? Why do you want to do this? Why is it worth your personal effort and the strife of going through this process to get these two specific proposals introduced?
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit reminded of that classic joke of besides this and that and the other thing, what has blank ever done for us? I think that there's a lot of things that you can do with check template verify. And with checksig from stack. And I think if it was just making ARC and Ledn symmetry, it would probably be enough. I am really excited about Vaults. That is a family of technologies that improves custody of Bitcoin. And it enables what's called reactive security. And so static security is where you define the exact setup of your keys. And you can say, given these keys, as long as nobody's gone bad or gone rogue, what security properties do I have? Reactive security would be, well, I noticed that this person has gone rogue. What options do I have from that point in time to do something with my funds? And one of the applications that I think is pretty appealing for me for CTV is you can set up a vacation wallet. And the vacation wallet basically has a coin that is lukewarm. And that lukewarm coin, you are able to make hot by moving it to your hot wallet, or you can make it cold by moving it to your cold wallet. Now, your hot wallet is on your mobile phone, and your cold wallet is like, plan a trip to the in-laws because you've got to go visit, 3 different locations. You don't want all of your funds to be in that cold wallet because you'll never get access to it unless you're willing to make this big journey. And in all likelihood, you're not going to store your keys as separate as you should because you don't want your backup to be so inaccessible. But if you are traveling and on vacation and somebody goes into your house and you just have the funds all in one place, someone could just steal your money. So by doing a separation of time, you can say, I have some keys at home. And when I go to move it to my hot wallet, it takes 3 weeks in order for the funds to get moved to my hot wallet. After 3 weeks, I can do whatever I want with it. But if I notice that the funds have moved and I know that I didn't authorize a movement of my funds to my hot wallet, I can then circumvent that transfer and I can send it to my deep cold and do my backup process. And what that means is you could now have funds that day to day, you're like, yeah, when I need to get money for rent or whatever, I know that I can initiate a withdrawal from the comfort of my own home. But if I'm traveling and I see that my funds have moved, then I'm going to be able to send it into my cold storage that I have to do a complicated, uncomfortable recovery process with. And that's something that I think for a lot of users is a pretty big benefit, and would be able to, with good UX built around it, increase the number of people who are willing to do self-custody.
So things are coalescing, at least in the, any prev out L2 kind of discussion you said before, that it seems like proposals are consolidating. There was this field of Covenant's proposals. Developers have now had the time to sit with them. We've eliminated some of these upgrades because we found that functionality can be replicated with other combinations of these opcodes. That sounds positive. What's at stake if this process just freezes for a while? Just, despite people kind of coming and advocating for it, there's a waiting period. What is that? Is there anything at stake if that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and this maybe gets into, why am I endorsing something? I think generally Bitcoin gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And you'll go through a generation of, well, we don't really have really good large number participant self-custodial payment solutions. And so all the Bitcoin volume is now going to move to Base on Coinbase. And we're going to use wrapped Bitcoin on Base. And yeah, sure, it's like some sort of BitGo like multi-sig, ultimately backing it, but it's more scalable. And to the extent that I trust them, I have my own keys on Base. And, I want my retirement account. And the best way to do that is with an ETF or with MicroStrategy. And you just get more and more non-self-custodial. And no one really has any sort of sovereignty over their money anymore. Maybe one day the government shows up and says, oh, by the way, we're doing a wealth tax on unrealized capital gains, and we're taking half your stack. And then everyone goes, oh no, that's awful, we don't want that, but not your keys, not your coin. And if 99% of Bitcoin is wrapped up in these corporate treasuries, and those corporate treasuries are on behalf of accounts, they're not like the actual company's Bitcoin, that's just going to happen. Everyone's going to get 6102'd. And the vision with Covenants, with CTV, is that we're empowering a new generation of builders. And this isn't like an abstract new generation of builders. It's people who are literally building protocols today who are saying, if we had this feature and this technology, we would be able to build a better version of what we're currently building. We'd be more likely to succeed if we had this technology. And I want to empower those builders to be able to build the best possible software to be able to keep Bitcoin decentralized. And I think that is really what it boils down to. If we don't do it for another year or two, it's probably fine. but it's already been like 5 years for CTV. So is it going to be another 2 years or is it going to be another five? And I think I think CTV is like older than MicroStrategy becoming like a Bitcoin company. So if we, wait another 5 years, is there going to be another MicroStrategy, or are we just going to keep seeing Bitcoin siphoned into these sort of corporate treasury vehicles? Or are we going to see individual users or groups of users able to coordinate and use the protocol directly and get the benefits that when I was a teenager reading the Satoshi white paper for the first time, dreamed about Bitcoin working. And I think that I don't see CTV and check from stack as being the end all be all of that, but I do see that there are like real development teams that are like asking for these primitives to be able to build better versions of Lightning, better versions of Arc, better custody, better mining pools, like many, many great use cases. And I think the reasons not to do it being, oh, well, like, what if it's the last upgrade? Or what if we could build a better one? It's like, okay, if you could build a better one, why didn't you build it in the last 5 years? And I would be happy to endorse really. And that is why I did a process of endorsement rather than saying, here's what I think is I want to see, well, like who is going to actually do the work and what are they proposing and what are they asking for? And when I saw Steven's tweet about specifically what he was excited about, specifically what he is working on, and from my knowledge of him as a developer, if he's able to execute or not, and talking to other developers of do you agree with this roadmap or not, it was really clear to me that if there is going to be an upgrade to Bitcoin this year, it will be CTV and check from stack. And it's fine if there's other technology we decide we want to go for as a network in the next upgrade. I'm okay with that. It's just certainly not going to happen in the next year. And if it's going to be Opcat, there's probably a different process that will, happen from now on. It's going to be TX hash. Steven's the author of TX hash, by the way. This is his proposed roadmap. So if it's going to be TX hash, it's probably going to be several years. And I'm okay with that, but I don't want to be in a situation where 10 years from now, we're looking back going, wow, Bitcoin got really centralized and we never shipped a covenant proposal.
Jeremy Rubin, where can people find out more about CTV and CSFS and these roadmaps that you're talking about?
I think that the two resources that I would direct you to is I'm going to try and tweet something about it every day. So follow me on Twitter at Jeremy Rubin. And there is Stephen Roos's website is covenants.info. And so I'm sure he'll be posting some updates there. Also watch the BIPS repository for updates on that. But there's not at this point like a super coordinated marketing team pushing for this. It's an ad hoc developer-led initiative.
Well, I'll be watching from the sidelines. Always a fan of the development process, and glad to see you moving forward. So appreciate your work there.
Thank you.
With the Supply Shock podcast, you can check it out where you get your podcasts. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. We'll see you in New York in just about a week for the Digital Asset Summit happening from March 18th to the 20th. Get your tickets now. I'll be there bringing a Bitcoin first perspective to a cryptocurrency conference. You'll see lots of folks from lots of institutions building on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Once again, Supply Shock, like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.